Hello, I'm Farah Nazarali, and I'm a very dedicated yoga student and passionate about how the practices of yoga are really incredible tools for physical, emotional, and mental health and well-being. And I'm really happy to be in conversation with Nicole Marcia, a dear friend and colleague. Nicole, how would you describe the work you do?
Hi, Farah. It's so great to be here. I would describe the work that I do as I'm a yoga therapist, and I specialize in supporting folks who are working through the experiences of trauma, addiction, and mental illness here in Vancouver, in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people.
Um, I'd love to hear your thoughts about whether you consider this pandemic a trauma and especially the impact for frontline workers and health professionals.
Yeah. Yeah, I think pandemic trauma is definitely real. One of the pieces I think that's been particularly profound about the pandemic is the experience of there not being a very sure end in sight. So for many people, traumatic experiences are experiences that are outside of the range of sort of everyday experiences that threaten the physical and perhaps also the emotional safety of oneself and others. And for many of us, those traumatic experiences have a beginning and a middle and an end. And then traditionally there's this sort of healing period or period of integration that may exist after a traumatic event. But we know also that that's not necessarily the lived experience of people who are equity seeking or really marginalized. For many people, or people who are living in really unsafe situations. So for many people, trauma is a daily, ongoing occurrence. And I would say globally, for many of us, the pandemic has put us into that experience of there being trauma that exists that doesn't necessarily have an ending. Um, and, in terms of what I've seen, if I was to paint it with a pretty broad brush, I've seen much higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of hopelessness, I think. And folks who may initially have had ways of coping that were really effective, seeing those ways of coping as no longer being as effective.
And I also know that you teach and share tools that can be really effective in cases of trauma and in the cases you're talking about. So let's talk a little bit about that, the tools that can be really utilized in a situation like this that has been so prolonged for many.
Well, I mean, I think that yoga does offer some physiological resources to support the regulation of the autonomic nervous system. So one of the things that we know about traumatic experience is that, it can leave us in a pretty heightened state. That can look like hyperarousal, hypervigilance, other kinds of intrusive symptoms like flashbacks, trouble sleeping, high levels of anxiety, decreased appetite, increased experiences of depression. And certainly there are many ways to use our bodies and our breath, and we can find some of these ways within the context of a yoga practice. So there are many ways to use our bodies and our breath in order to address some of those kinds of experiences. And some of those kinds of experiences are best addressed in the context of community and relationship. So we're not necessarily suggesting to people like, here's practice, do it alone, do it in isolation, manage your own um, nervous system, and then you'll be okay. The idea is more come together in community, break the kind of isolation that is inherent in the aftermath of a traumatic experience for many people, and the kind of isolation that's been inherent within the pandemic. So come into community, co-regulate with other folks, using these tools, these body-based and breath-based tools. And, hopefully what we're doing is we're creating spaces for people to co-regulate, and in that co-regulation, be in the kinds of relationships in which healing from trauma can occur. So online communities, in-person communities, working one-on-one or working with groups, anything that brings people together with one another and breaks isolation is really, really helpful. And yoga is one of the ways that we break that isolation. It also happens to have within it some really helpful tools and techniques for supporting physiological regulation.